Welcome to the BBB National Programs podcast, The Bistro, where we will discuss today's hottest consumer trends, predict the future with consumer experts, and learn how elite businesses and entrepreneurs continue to push the envelope to meet and shape the consumer's needs in the marketplace.
Hello and welcome to the Bistro podcast. I'm your host, Elaine Espinola. Earlier this year, the UK's Committees of Advertising Practice issued a comprehensive ban on gender stereotypes in broadcast, online, and print advertising. Under the new rules, companies advertising in the UK can no longer create ads that portray men or women in gender stereotypical activities, claiming such promotions carry, quote, harmful consequences and contribute to pay inequality and psychological harm to society. This recently imposed ban across the pond had us wondering about advertising regulatory practices in the United States and what changes, if any, we'll see as a result of the UK ban in America. Joining us today on the Bistro to share her thoughts and insights is Sheila Millar, attorney and partner at Keller Heckman LLP, where she represents businesses and trade associations on a variety of public policy and regulatory issues. Sheila, thank you so much for joining us today on the Bistro.
Thank you for having me, Elaine.
We really appreciate you being here. This is an interesting topic. And I guess, can we start out by having you kind of share how advertising is regulated differently here in the United States versus in the UK? And then also, what were your initial thoughts when you heard of the new advertising code that states advertisements must not include gender stereotypes that are likely to cause harm or serious or widespread offense?
Sure, that's a great question, Elaine. And I think it's important to start with the distinction between regulation and self-regulation. So all mature economies have laws that regulate false, deceptive, and unfair advertising, just as we do in the U.S. Mm-hmm. And those economies also have self-regulatory bodies like the ASA in the U.K. that, much as NAD does in the U.S., will accept and evaluate complaints about deceptive and false advertising. Let's talk about some of those differences, though. Typically in Europe and in many parts of the world, the starting point for self-regulatory codes of advertising and marketing practice come from or derive from the International Chamber of Commerce's Code of Marketing and Advertising Practices. I'm very familiar with the ICC because I've been active with the ICC Marketing and Advertising Commission for many years and have been working on the code developments for many years. What's interesting about the ICC code is that conceptually, many of the provisions of the code are translated in the U.S. self-regulatory framework. But the ICC code starts with the principle that advertising should be legal, decent, truthful, and honest. Mm-hmm. And this concept of decency is a concept that is embedded in the situation in the EU and elsewhere, but that concept of decency isn't so readily translatable in the U.S. It's not that we don't want ads to be decent, mm-hmm. But we accept them as a concept of how the market will reflect or accept advertising. So, for example, you'll see a lot more scantily clad models in France than you will in the U.S., including on television. It's simply more culturally accepted. So that is a significant difference. The right. ASA provisions on gender stereotypes really derive from an environment where, much more significantly than in the U.S., the idea of using advertising self-regulation to promote social change is more accepted in self-regulation as well as in regulation, and that is not particularly common in the U.S. and potentially could violate the First Amendment here in the U.S. So I think that's just a quick overview of why we see those differences.
Sure. And that's kind of the gist of it, right? That's kind of how they do things in the UK, but that's not how our regulation works here in the US. You mentioned the ASA code. Let's discuss the broader implications of the new ASA code provision and a couple of enforcement actions enforcing the prohibition on harmful gender stereotyping on advertising and advertisers here in the US and globally. What does this say about society and consumers overall? How much of a role really do consumers play in developing advertising self-regulatory codes and standards?
Let's maybe work backwards on these questions. Mm-hmm. So in some regions, some countries, there is a stakeholder process for advertising. Mm-hmm. There is not a formal stakeholder process for advertising self-regulation in the U.S., neither at NAD or at KRU, and there really isn't a formal process at the ICC code level either. But of course, advertising sits in society, mm-hmm. and the whole purpose of advertising is to sell products and services and to promote your brand. So basically, advertisers want consumers to respond positively to their messages and need to be aware of and alert to changes of thinking in the marketplace that will affect how consumers respond to their ads, as well as developments competitively and technologically that affect advertising, because advertisers also have a big stake in making sure that there's a fair and level playing field for advertising, because that's what's going to promote confidence.
Sure.
Going back to your initial question of the enforcement actions and what those actions are potentially going to mean for advertisers here in the U.S. and elsewhere, it may be helpful to just take a minute to give a brief word about it. There were two ads that were subject to enforcement action for what ASA determined was harmful gender stereotyping. One was an ad for a food product featuring two dads with young kids going to a cafeteria type of place where they were so impressed or taken with the taste of, I think it was Philadelphia cream cheese, that they put the kids on this conveyor belt. They were going around and round, and then at the end they said, "Let's not tell mom."
Okay.
And then the second ad was an ad that started with a shot of a man and a woman in a tent zipping up the tent, and then active shots of men engaged in very kind of high-risk athletic pursuits. There was a woman on a park bench, and then there was, just sitting quietly, and the ASA determined that it was a harmful gender stereotype. So I think in both of these issues, the idea of harmful gender stereotyping in the ASA code is reflected in some of their guidance, where they are trying to kind of draw a line between ads that appropriately feature people undertaking roles that might be gender stereotyped, but making sure that it's not done in a harmful way, and
right.
ads that are potentially going to promote gender stereotypes. So as with anything in the environment, global advertisers want to advertise globally. A lot of campaigns are regional or national, even local in nature, for a variety of good reasons. Mm-hmm. But you want to make sure that you're responding to your consumers. And so what I think we see translated in the U.S., and I just happened to be watching the news last night, and I saw an ad for, I think it was T-Mobile, and it was all about first responders and veterans. And there was a woman jumping into a firefighter's costume, and there was a man hugging a child. So I think there is this sensitivity to the concept of showing people accepting roles that may not be true to the stereotypes in mm-hmm. a good way, without imposing kind of the self-regulatory oversight.
Sure. You mentioned kind of roles, but let's talk about the roles of advertising and self-regulation in general. How would you define that, the role that we should take on that? And then, what is our current process for developing advertising self-regulatory codes and standards in the U.S. now?
So having been involved in self-regulation for many, many years, I'm a big fan of self-regulation. I think it can be flexible. It can move with the times. It can allow industry to figure out and respond to issues really quickly. I've been active in the Children's Advertising Review Unit, for example, and over the years as the guidelines have been updated, they've sought to address new issues and concerns in a meaningful way, but one that also respects our culture, our society, our First Amendment, our legal framework as well. And so I think there are ways that society moves and that interests and issues change that may not be and likely will never be reflected in self-regulatory codes. And I think this gender stereotyping may be an example of one of those situations.
Sure. So, Sheila, as we established, we don't have a self-regulatory code provision like this in the United States. And of course, we likely won't see one, as you mentioned, based on our advertisers' First Amendment rights. Do you think that will ever change? Why or why not? Maybe you talked about that a little bit, but expand upon that.
I don't think it will necessarily change. We do see some self-regulatory codes, for example, in the alcohol beverage industry that address overt sexualization in an inappropriate way as part of that industry sector code. But I think there's also a fine line between what we think is humor or exaggerated or funny and gender stereotyping.
Sure.
So I think it would be very challenging on a broad cover the market basis for advertising self-regulatory codes to broadly address gender stereotyping.
Sure. And based on that, what can advertisers do to help create their ads that are more reflective of culturally acceptable norms in a way that's both evolving to meet social consumer trends, but still achieving their financial goals? What thoughts do you have there?
Again, advertisers want to reach markets. They want to sell products and
Right.
services. And so they do want to be respectful of trends. And I think there are many examples of advertisers that take on political issues that may not be popular. Think about the Colin Kaepernick ads, for example.
Right.
And just think about what we see now with showing, a woman who's working on a telephone line, and I think it's a Dove commercial where I want to feel beautiful after a hard day and wash all the dirt off. Mm-hmm. So I think we do see naturally in the U.S. environment these types of commercials. You see men doing the laundry. You see, but in the U.S. environment, you see a man ordering out pizza and the kids are running wild, like, we got to clean this up before mom gets home.
Right.
That might be harmful gender stereotyping under the ASA.
Right.
It's hard to imagine that is an actionable ad that would capture the attention of NAD in the U.S. environment. But I think that idea of allow the marketplace to work, allow self-regulation to focus on what it does best in the U.S., and then look at how advertising can quietly reinforce social changes that are meaningful to consumers and that they care about. Because ultimately the issue is consumers are going to let you know with their pocketbooks.
Right. And that was a question I was going to ask too. As consumers' voices grow louder and louder with their pocketbook or in other ways, do you foresee advertising being more influenced by social demands of our society?
I think advertising already is influenced by social demands of the society.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you do probably very much less frequently will see what looks to be a gay couple in an ad. You certainly see interracial couples in ads very frequently now. And so if you think about how advertising has evolved over the past 10, 15, 20, 30 years, you see a huge sea change. It's not just mom in an apron,
Right.
in the kitchen. You see a variety of consumers taking on different roles in advertising, interfacing with each other, with families, and you see dynamics of families that don't look like the families of the 50s, 60s, and 70s anymore.
Right.
And I think that's just reflective of changes in society as a whole. Advertisers are really good at trying to figure out what consumers want, and so they're going to respond to those needs by, in a way, reflecting what society looks like today in their advertising.
Sure. And I agree. I mean, you can see them on TV. We've certainly evolved, and we've have fuller figured women in commercials and diverse people in different commercials and advertisements. And so we have evolved. One question is, should companies care if their ads are offensive to some, right? If they're still selling products. So obviously the idea is that in the UK, well, these are offensive. We're banning them. But if anyone's offended here in the U.S., do the companies care? Should they care if they're still selling products?
I think it depends on the company. I mean, some companies want to present an image. Some people want national consistency. But again, I think what's harmful in terms of, or likely to cause offense in terms of gender stereotyping, I'm still of the view that if it's offensive to somebody, they're not going to buy your product.
Right.
If consumers think it's funny and they buy the products regardless, it's a consumer choice. And so I think in the U.S. marketplace, we do value consumer choice. We do value the ability of the marketer to allow market forces to prevail within that backdrop of what's false, deceptive, misleading, or unfair, and where you might be certainly in the children's product area, where there are more specific provisions to address the reduced capacity to understand and defend against advertising that children have compared to adults, which is why more prescriptive rules on how you advertise to children are relevant to child-directed advertising and maybe not to traditional advertising or adult-oriented advertising.
Sure. That makes sense. That makes a lot of sense. Earlier, you talked about the global economy a bit. How might the UK ban affect the way businesses in the U.S. view their own advertising practices now, especially if they're a global company?
Well, for my clients, many of whom are global marketers, if they are involved in a self-regulatory action that involves or results in a ruling against them, they're going to take it seriously. They want to understand it. And they do try to understand how that may or may not translate into other markets. It's expensive to shoot a commercial,
right,
especially a television commercial. If you have to pull it off the market, that's not good. So companies do want to understand those rules. It may lead some companies to really refocus some of their advertising and really think about gender stereotyping. It may result in a determination that, we did testing of this ad. Consumers love it in the U.S., so they love it in China. So we're going to keep airing it in those jurisdictions because we want to respond to consumers. But maybe they'll do different commercials featuring gender roles in a different way in future commercials. So I think it's very much dependent on the company and how they want to advertise, how they want to manage their global advertising in the most efficient and effective way.
Sure. All great information, Sheila. As we wrap up here, what advice would you give advertisers on how to adjust to meet consumers' demand for social change?
Well, I think advertisers, again, are always thinking about social change. And I do think there is this natural evolution of advertising. As I said earlier, we see a lot of mixed race couples on television ads and other types of ads. That's happened naturally as a result of social change. You see more diversity in advertising. That's happened naturally. And part of it is, when demographic features change, you want to make sure that your ads are reaching people. And if you are better able to reach people by showing actors in ads who look more like the general population, that is likely to be more effective for you. So I think a lot of it has those elements of self-interest by the advertiser in making sure the ads are effective. But I think there are socially motivated advertisers who make choices about advertising because they themselves want to, as a company, be involved in those social changes. And so we do see, just in not so much in advertising necessarily, but in states where some of the laws have been restricting transgender bathrooms, for example. Some companies said, we're not going to hold our conferences there. We're going to think about not shooting a commercial there or not doing something there. I think those are all parts of the social fabric of the U.S. And again, part of how we, as a market-based economy, look to that vibrant economy to help determine how we're going to manage social change.
Got it. All great information, Sheila. We really appreciate you being here with us on the Bistro, taking the time to speak with us and share your insights. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
To our listeners, we want to thank you for joining us. We hope you enjoyed this episode, and we'd love to hear your feedback. If you haven't already, subscribe to the Bistro, give us your rating and review, and share our podcast to help us inspire others. I'm Elena Spinola, host of the Bistro podcast, and until next time, it has been my pleasure discussing better business and advertising insights with you.
You just enjoyed the Bistro podcast. Be sure to tune in next time for a brand new episode. To learn more about our other shows, visit betterbusiness.blueberry.com. That's betterbusiness.blueberry.com. Follow us on Twitter at BBB_NTL programs. Send your comments and ideas to podcast@bbbnp.org. The thoughts and opinions expressed on this podcast are the views and opinions of the guests, not those of the BBB national programs or its affiliates. This podcast is for information and educational purposes only and is copyrighted with all rights reserved. This podcast is protected by Blueberry's Terms of Service.